I'm not intimidated at all to be critiquing this film. Ah. Released on Netflix in May of 2020, the half of it is a coming-of-age romantic comedy written and directed by Alice Wu. The film is set in the fictional town of Skohamish and centers around a high schooler named Ellie Chu, who lives with her widowed father and is introduced as being quiet, shy, and really intelligent. The inciting incident of the film occurs when Paul, a seemingly stereotypical dumb jock, approaches Ellie to help him write a love letter to his crush, Esther, who Ellie happens to also have feelings for. Though on the surface, the movie is a heartwarming tale about love in all its forms, I want to dig a little deeper in this video and talk about the areas in which the film may have faltered in its execution, as well as explore a possible common cause. Of course, I can't possibly start critiquing the film without first acknowledging what it did so well in. It goes without saying, but the film created some much-needed representation of Asian American and LGBT characters in a very white heterosexual media landscape. Going beyond the tokenism and stereotyping we so often see, the film paints a much more nuanced image of the people in these communities and their experiences. This is probably attributed to the director Alice Wu also identifying as a queer Asian American herself, and this personal connection may have allowed for a more honest and very personal take on the feeling of being an outsider. Alice Wu's personal connection to the story was also reflected in the evident thought and care put into every aspect of the film. Just listening to her talk about how the opening sequence was conceptualized and constructed, or the different ways she guided the actors through their scenes, leave no room for doubt about it. Just look at Ellie Chu, a very fleshed out character, complex and nuanced both in her portrayal and her writing. The film manages to take us through this very intimate and heartfelt exploration of a character, making it easy for the audience to root for her while still acknowledging her flaws. Another aspect I find the film excels in is its portrayal of what it's like to be a teenager. There's just that profound sense of loneliness, cynicism, and over-exaggeration of everything that happens that the film manages to capture so well. Not to mention, there are some genuinely funny moments, and some very heartfelt ones. And I think that everything the film so brilliantly accomplishes is what allows for people to identify with the story and the characters. I've watched videos, read comments from people that express how touched they were by the movie and how it made them feel seen, and ultimately, that emotional connection to the story, I think, eclipses anything negative I can point out. That being said, let's delve into the critiques and leave that conversation about my inability to enjoy anything for another time. Okay, so I've been having some difficulties figuring out how to structure this section, so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna start by listing out some of the issues I had with the film upon first viewing. I'll elaborate on each of them, and then I'll discuss the possible common core problem that led to these issues, and then we'll quickly revisit them again through that lens. Maybe a bit confusing to explain, so let's just jump straight into the first issue. So the movie is really focused on exploring Ellie's character, her goals, her relationships, which is great. Like I said, the film manages to do this really effectively, and it resulted in a sympathetic yet flawed main character for the audience to follow. But because of how strong the writing for Ellie is, the supporting characters in comparison just seem to fall short of believable. The closest we probably get, despite his lack of screen time, is Ellie's father, who we understand is still grieving the loss of his wife, stuck in a foreign land where he's unable to progress and lead a better life because of factors outside of his control, such as his inability to speak English well, and this leads him to be largely dependent on his daughter. Following him is a cast of characters ranging from kind of sympathetic to human incarnations of plot devices. But for now, let's just focus on the leads, specifically Esther and Paul. They're very much archetypes you would see in a typical high school rom-com. They represent the popular girl who doesn't quite fit in, and the jock with a heart of gold, destined to fall in love with each other, while Ellie is the shy, overlooked nerd that throws a wrench in that plan. The film attempts to delve deeper than this though, and flesh them out as people in their own right, rather than one-dimensional leads with just enough complementing personality traits to be convincing love interests. At least, it's obvious that's what the intention is. But in terms of execution, it may not have translated as well. We have Paul, who is introduced as a dumb jock, but is later revealed to have aspirations, a kind heart, and just problems expressing himself. A good part of the plot is dedicated to setting up how Paul wants but feels unable to contribute to his family's business in a more meaningful way. But that culminates in just one line to his mother at the end of the climax of the whole movie, where it's played off as a joke, and then never revisited. And for the rest of the movie, Paul seems to exist solely in service of rounding out Ellie's character arc. Because of this, Paul's biggest point of growth becomes learning to accept his gay friend, which wasn't even set up as a plot point until way later in the movie. Like, we know Paul isn't super religious, and nothing told us he was even a bit homophobic. Sure, you could say there wasn't a situation where he was given a chance to express it, but it still stands that in order for something to have weight in the second half of the plot, it has to be properly established in the first. I mean, it could have been something as simple as two same-gendered classmates holding hands and him making a face at it. And at the end of the day, I guess this faith-based homophobia isn't super deep-rooted either, since he has a 180 shift in opinion after a short conversation with Ellie's dad in which he could really only understand one line. So instead of a fully realized character arc of a young son in a big family finding his voice and creating change, or even maybe a conservative small town boy having his opinions on homosexuality changed through forming a meaningful relationship with someone prior to finding out about their sexuality, we get a shoddily executed half of each plotline, resulting in an ending for Paul that just feels rushed and honestly kind of disappointing for something that had so much potential. And then there's Esther, the object of affection, pretty, intelligent, and seemingly fleshed out just enough for the audience to understand why Paul and Ellie are enamored of her. She spends the whole movie feeling conflicted about whether to be with Paul, someone who she thinks represents a more brave and honest love, or stay with Trig and have a relationship that is safe and predictable, despite knowing it'll never satisfy her want to be understood. Esther's arc in the film centers around this choice, and it's a big one. It requires a lot of growth and self-analysis on her own appetite for risk and comfort to properly make. But her character never seems to have any real agency or say in how the narrative progresses. Like, some dude writes her a letter while she's in a relationship and she's like, okay, I'll respond. And then he asks her out on dates and she just goes. And then he kisses her and she just lets him. I mean, she goes to Paul's house wanting to spend time with him and finds Ellie there instead, and she just goes, do you want to spend the day with me instead? Like, all the choices she makes seem to just forward the narrative of Paul and Ellie pursuing her without actually establishing what she wants in the process. But okay, she coasts along, and we finally get to the point where she is forced to make what is, according to the plot, the most important decision of her life. Trig proposes. And with the hurt from opening her heart to new possibilities still fresh in her mind, she makes her choice. She'd rather have a predictable life that promises security rather than put her heart on the line once more. But again, the decision is taken out of her hands. And again, she just goes with it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but throughout the whole film, she never once makes a difficult decision. And to me, that signals a lack of growth in her character. But that doesn't seem to matter because the film tries to tell us that the payoff to all of this is that she learned to take risks in some aspects of her life and chooses to go to art school despite never having shown a real interest or inclination towards being an artist other than being kind of good at painting. I don't know, I always assumed the discussions on art were more philosophical or symbolic of boldness in the pursuit of love and not an actual setup for Esther's aspirations. I'm sorry, but that just feels kind of cheap. And then let's talk about the cast of hilariously one-dimensional supporting characters. I don't know what to say about them other than they're not people. Because the main conflict of the plot is largely internal, their contribution at any point of time is limited to one of three things. The first being comic relief, which often feels out of place because of how over the top it is compared to the more intimate and personal feel of the movie, but more on that later. Second, they're plot devices that illustrate our main trio's current struggles or create obstacles that they then have to overcome. Third, they're used as a tool to trick the audience into thinking Esther and Paul are more fully realized than they are just by sheer comparison. Alice Wu mentioned in an interview that the film is about the nature of love, and that's easy to see. I mean, the setup of the film indicates as much, from watching the romance between Paul and Esther blossom on the basis of deception, to witnessing the growth of Ellie and Paul's friendship, to listening to Mr. Chu's take on unconditional love. The film attempts to explore a wide range of ideas, threading it together with the common theme of love. But here's my problem with it. It just feels unfocused. Let me explain. So one of the first conversations Ellie and Paul have about Esther is how Paul knows he's in love with her. And what he says is actually really interesting. It poses the question of whether love is effort as we see with Paul, intellect as we see with Ellie, or if it's simply just instinct or intuition. I think this is already a pretty promising premise to dig deeper into. But a few letters into the exchange, the motive of painting is brought into the mix, and the debate between safety in the familiar versus courage to take risks in love begins. It feels like a pretty separate topic altogether. But let's just continue, see where they go. Maybe they'll be able to navigate two separate but concurrent discussions parallel to each other skillfully. But then, about halfway into the film, the setting of a small conservative town becomes more than just that, and the factor of personal faith and religion starts to play a bigger role than previously set up. The film makes this whole thematic thread appear intentional by placing Ellie and Asta on opposite ends of the belief spectrum, while Paul sits somewhere in the middle. And these three fundamentally different topics are explored in different types of relationships as well: romantic, platonic, and familial. Maybe we can argue and say the film is simply layered, but there are times where it just feels overly so. It never properly narrows down the scope of what it wants to explore, at least not enough to effectively take the audience through a coherent narrative journey. Each new question the film attempts to pose, though interesting, is super complex on its own, with dozens of different possible takes on it, and to squeeze them all together into one concurrent plot spreads the narrative out way too thin, and leaves the exploration of these different facets of love feeling diluted and surface level. To better illustrate my point, I'm gonna name some films: Pretty Woman, Silver Linings Playbook, Frozen. Despite these all being vastly different films, all the narratives can be thematically classified under the overarching umbrella of love. But it's the narrowed scope of focus within this theme and the execution of the film's unique perspective on the matter that sets each of these films apart and makes its storytelling so effective. Pretty Woman discusses issues of class and inequality in relation to love. Silver Linings Playbook delves deep into the topics of mental illness and recovery in the context of a love story. And Frozen asserts that familial love can be just as powerful as romantic love. Yes, this is kind of a gross oversimplification of these films, but the point is that they each understand the core topic they are trying to discuss and what their take on it is. In comparison, the half of it just feels a little confused. It almost seems like the film chooses the quantity of topics over depth of exploration. And because of this, I don't know what this look is, or this look is, or this look is. Because depending on which storyline you want to focus on, it can mean any of like 5 different things. This also leads to smaller yet still glaring problems like taking time in an already crowded movie to set up narratives that don't ever pay off, or add seemingly redundant scenes that don't drive the action of the story, such as Trig thinking Ellie is in love with him, or letting us know that Ellie and Asta's families are both having financial issues without ever revisiting it again. Or this one scene. It's beautiful, but if its main purpose was to show the connection Ellie and Asta have as compared to Asta and Paul, I thought that's what the letters were supposed to already make sufficiently clear. Yes, there's that sense of ease and intimacy in their real-life interactions, but I think the letters they exchange already convey that, albeit in a more indirect, unconventional way. I'm so sorry, but this scene just frustrates me whenever I watch the movie. I know a lot of people love it, but it just reads like a scene added in the first few drafts that the writer was so proud of that they just could never bear to remove it in the following revisions of the script. But maybe it's also just something I'm not understanding about it. And in the climax, there's this quote from Ellie that's supposed to be the display of this journey of growth she has undertaken. A summary of her learnt lessons, if you will. But at this point, the plot has become so convoluted that her statement, though strong, doesn't really apply. I don't know, I feel like the film is so caught up in adding details without first establishing what it's even about. So many different things are happening, yet there's no coherent thematic thread to hold it together. Because of the film's heavy focus on the internal struggles of our main characters and the mundanity of small-town life, it often feels very grounded in reality. So when we get to those moments where certain situations or characters are exaggerated for a dramatic effect or to set our protagonists apart, it just feels a bit off. Take this scene for example. A creative choice was definitely made to overplay how self-absorbed Trig is and how attractive other girls seem to find him so as to visualize Asta's inability to connect with her current peers. This makes sense, but the way it's executed is just so unrealistic. Like, it feels too loud and overplayed to possibly exist in the same mellower, subdued world that the film has constructed through its visual language and otherwise realistic writing. For comparison, let's take a look at this scene from Bo Burnham's 8th grade. I think this scene perfectly captures the experience of feeling out of the loop and unable to enter into a conversation, and the anxiety that comes along with it. That sense of being in a crowded room and still feeling lonely is so effectively conveyed without needing to reduce the supporting characters to caricatures or elevate the situation to the point of being unrealistic. There's already plenty of drama you can find in everyday situations, yet the film seems to always opt for the slightly more unbelievable option. This also applies to certain behaviors that would be deemed inappropriate and problematic in real life, such as stalking, deception, cheating, non-consensual physical advances, and a freaking teacher ignoring and even encouraging a student to edit half a class's essays so she wouldn't have to go through the torture of reading bad work. No one even bats an eye at any of these behaviors, and the moral implications are never discussed unless it serves the plot. It just feels a bit off-putting when our main character is crafted to feel like someone we could know in real life, yet the film places her in a world that looks like, but behaves distinctly different than ours. So we've talked about how the half of it has been described as a coming-of-age rom-com by its writer and director Alice Wu. And at first glance, this seems pretty fitting. I mean, the film does take us through the journey of our main character going through several typical milestones of teenagehood, the most significant of which is falling in love. She forms meaningful relationships, goes through some form of hardship that forces her to mature and embrace herself, and finally, she leaves home. But let's dig a little deeper into what it means to be a coming-of-age romantic comedy and look at how trying to balance the two genres may have contributed to the problems we've been talking about. Though rom-coms and coming-of-age films have a long history of intersecting, a la Say Anything, 16 Candles, Clueless, etc., they have developed to become largely different genres in recent years in order to adapt to the modern audience's needs and expectations. So typically, the driving force of rom-coms is the romance, and all the action that takes place serve to pull our leads together, apart, then back together again. The use of tropes such as the grand gesture, the meet-cute, the less than fleshed-out supporting characters, though predictable, are often excused because of its role in helping to achieve the ultimate goal of the movie. However, because of the unrealistic expectations and harmful ideas often perpetuated in rom-coms, along with its reputation as simply being lightweight feel-good fluff, audiences started to tire of these films, leading to what's referred to as the rom-com fatigue of the early 2000s. In recent years, though, we've seen a resurgence in the popularity of such films, the more successful ones being those that have reinvented or subverted the tropes and conventions of the genre, featuring a more diverse cast and looking at the toxic behavior typically normalized in these films with a more critical eye. But despite them providing a more modern, updated take on the typical white heterosexual romance, rom-coms remain hopeful, heartwarming, and a little less than realistic. Though rom-coms of recent years have started playing out in worlds that look more familiar to us, the primary goal of the happy ending and allowing audiences to feel good after the end credits roll remains. And because that's just not something the unpredictable and chaotic real world allows for, we as the audience accept this so as to escape to a more hopeful world where soulmates undoubtedly exist and happiness lasts a lifetime. Similar to the rom-com, the early and most iconic films of this genre, such as The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, play out in a world more optimistic and idealistic than ours. A world where a group of diverse but still archetypal white and heterosexual individuals can go through a single experience and emerge from it more mature and empathetic just hours later. Classic films of this genre relied on a cliched and impractical representation of the shared experience of growing up, often repeating similar themes just under different guises. However, as audiences evolved, so did the films in this genre. As Natalie Holderbaum puts it in her article, young adults are no longer looking for an idealized narrative, where everything happens to fall into place and end in a happily ever after. That's the same plot they've seen in at least 6 other films. Unlike the rom-com, modern audiences of the coming-of-age film no longer look to them for an escape, but rather a nuanced reflection of our world and a sense of shared experience. With the critical success and massive outpour of love for films such as Call Me By Your Name, Moonlight, Lady Bird, 8th Grade, Juno, so on and so forth, we can see that the success of the modern-day coming-of-age film hinges on how believable and fleshed out the characters are and how well they adhere to the realities of our world and represent the struggles faced by youths in today's context. Now that we've talked about the initial success and eventual development of rom-coms and coming-of-age films, we can sort of see how the similarities in their world building allowed for early hybrid genre films such as the aforementioned 3 to succeed and remain classics in both genres. They're feel-good movies that don't pretend to be more. And I'm not necessarily saying that films that identify as coming-of-age romantic comedies won't work in the modern context. Just look at Love, Simon, which has received much praise and acclaim from its audiences and critics alike. All I'm saying is that because of how the two genres have evolved to possess inherently different goals and conventions, films that incorporate both are required to have that much more tact in its execution, which, if I'm being honest, I can't say the half of it does. The movie seems to have trouble negotiating differences between the two genres, attempting to fulfill yet subvert the conventions of both. There are aspects of the film that feel fitting as part of a romantic comedy, yet out of place in a coming-of-age film, and vice versa. It fails to reconcile the differences between the two in a consistent, intentional way. Because of this, there's an uncomfortable duality in the film. It gives us the complex protagonist befitting of a coming-of-age film, which is to say they're still believable if placed in the context of our world, yet she's surrounded by a cast of characters seemingly lifted straight off a rom-com, people who exist solely in service to the development of the romance. And thanks to the beautifully nuanced and honest portrayal, we as the audience feel the weight and loneliness of being a gay Asian American teenager. Yet, acts such as stalking, deception, and cheating, which very much happen in our world, are carelessly committed and then just glossed over, forgotten. I think this genre confusion that the half of it faces is ultimately at the root of most of its problems. It's progressive, yet outdated. Realistic, yet not believable. As Alice Wu mentioned in an interview, as a writer, there will always be some aspect of wish fulfillment in your scripts. And I think maybe because of the personal connection she has to Ellie Chu, it may have blinded her to the inconsistencies and contradictions in the rest of the plot. It feels like the significance of the movie lies mainly in what people make of it and how they relate to it, rather than a message that the film consistently has and attempts to convey. By the end of the day, the power of a movie lies not in how well it holds up to critical scrutiny, but in how it makes people feel. And I think it's safe to say, it makes people feel a lot.